I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views.
We knew the story of the international rules-based order was partially false, that the strongest would exempt themselves when convenient, that trade rules were enforced asymmetrically. And we knew that international law applied with varying rigor depending on the identity of the accused or the victim. This fiction was useful, and American hegemony in particular helped provide public goods, open sea lanes, a stable financial system, collective security, and support for frameworks for resolving disputes. So we placed the sign in the window. We participated in the rituals, and we largely avoided calling out the gaps between rhetoric and reality. This bargain no longer works. Let me be direct. We are in the midst of a rupture, not a transition. What does it mean for middle powers to live the truth? Well, first, it means naming reality. Stop invoking rules-based international order as though it still functions as advertised. Call it what it is, a system of intensifying great power rivalry where the most powerful pursue their interests using economic integration as coercion. It means acting consistently, applying the same standards to allies and rivals. When middle powers criticize economic intimidation from one direction but stay silent when it comes from another, we are keeping the sign in the window. It means building what we claim to believe in. Rather than waiting for the old order to be restored, it means creating institutions and agreements that function as described. And it means reducing the leverage that enables coercion. That's building a strong domestic economy. It should be every government's immediate priority. And diversification internationally is not just economic prudence, it's a material foundation for honest foreign policy, because countries earn the right to principled stands by reducing their vulnerability to retaliation. We have a recognition of what's happening and a determination to act accordingly. We understand that this rupture calls for more than adaptation. It calls for honesty about the world as it is. We are taking the sign out of the window. We know the old order is not coming back. We shouldn't mourn it. Nostalgia is not a strategy. But we believe that from the fracture, we can build something bigger, better, stronger, more just. This is the task of the middle powers. The countries that have the most to lose from a world of fortresses and a most to gain from genuine cooperation.
Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. What you just heard were two excerpts from a speech Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney gave this past week at the World Economic Forum in Davos. That very speech will inform much of the discussion we have today with guest Deep State Kuba, a geopolitical analyst who has worked in both the public and private sector and is a regular guest on the This Is Revolution podcast, as well as Give Them an Argument with Ben Burgis. Mark Carney's speech tells us that the old order, the post-Cold War, rules-based international order led by the United States of America is dead. What exactly does that mean? We'll get into it with Deep State Kuba. But before we do that, I'd like to remind you that this show is made possible by both my one and only sponsor, Mike Swanson of Wall Street Window, as well as you, the listeners, who support this show on Patreon. If you can, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And also, if you can, visit my sponsor, Mike Swanson's wallstreetwindow.com for your financial and trading needs. I've had listeners make a return on investment thanks to Mike's trading tips, and I highly recommend subscribing to his newsletter at wallstreetwindow.com. If you subscribe now, you can also get a copy of Mike's free ebook, The twofold formula, the single best trading pattern I have ever used. So one more time, that's wallstreetwindow.com. Check it out. And with that being said, let's get right to the conversation with Deep State Kuba. Welcome back to Parallax Views, a guest that I haven't had on, I think, since 2022, but he's been a friend of the show. He's a notable guest on Jason Miles' This Is Revolution, and also Give Them an Argument with Ben Burgis. And he's known just as Deep State Kuba. And he has a geopolitical background, and we're going to be talking geopolitics and well, just the craziness of everything happening right now. I have to keep myself from swearing because the Apple will, give me issues if it's explicit content. But I want to use the word that begins with an S and ends with an T, has an H-I in the middle. Ugh. How are you doing, though, Deep State Kuba?
These are interesting times, and it's a bit of a roller coaster because, just as Steve Bannon recommended, the Trump administration is moving from one spectacular spectacle to another. We were less than a week into 2026, less than a year into Donald Trump's first year, second term as president, and already he went into Venezuela, kidnapped the leader, Nicolas Maduro, extradited him to New York. But now that story is completely vanished because we've moved on to threats against Greenland, threats against Canada, changes in the international order that have been triggered by American actions, movements by European powers, by Canada, by other states to try to adjust to this new reality. And everything is happening so quickly that it creates a certain vertigo and exhaustion. But I'm fighting against that, trying to stay ahead, trying to parse what's going on and figure out exactly what the implications are for the medium and long term.
So I know the place we wanted to start was, I guess, Mark Carney's recent statements, the Canadian Prime Minister, and I guess bigger picture, I don't know if you saw anything else from the World Economic Forum, but that was a wild show this time around in Davos.
Indeed. And typically there's a tone and a format to the Davos meetings, which emphasizes consensus, emphasizes the durability and stability of the international order, especially with respect to economic considerations for the plutocratic members of the WEF. And this time, it turned into a bit of a train wreck, and a lot of that has to do with the discomfort of having a president that is dedicated to tearing down the very institutions and structures that the members of the World Economic Forum rely on in their economic decision-making and in their long-term investment strategies. So you have the bull invited into the china shop and not even on his best behavior. The tone that was set by Mark Carney's initial speech, that was kind of statesmanship classic, trying to react in a measured and responsible way to unexpected developments in the world, try to frame the problems and challenges faced not only by Canada, but by many of the so-called middle powers that Carney was referencing, and many European states, as the ground shifts out from under them, as the structures that they relied upon to make sense of the world and to plan their own security, economic, and foreign policies, things like NATO, things like the transatlantic relationship, UN-based multilateralism, and deepening economic integration through things like the World Trade Organization. To a certain extent, Davos itself is an emanation. It's an institution, an informal one, of that kind of multilateral liberal world order. And all of that is being undermined in real time. Everything solid is turning into quicksand. And there's a great deal of uncertainty about how countries can manage this and we can see different strategies that they're employing. Carney laid out in a very sober way that the structural adjustment required in order to maintain sovereignty in this new environment means building greater resilience, greater domestic capacity. I believe the phrase that he used was countries that cannot feed, power, or defend themselves are not meaningfully sovereign in any way, paraphrase him. Now, that adjustment is fundamentally reshaping relationships and turning around crises and confrontations in ways that really, I was almost going to say in ways that no one had ever seen before, and then I realized that was the Trump toxin getting into my brain. But consider the relationship between China and Canada. Under Justin Trudeau, there was stark deterioration in that bilateral relationship. A lot of that came about as a result of Canada playing a loyal partner role within the Western alliance led by the United States. Things like the arrest and detention of Meng Wanzhou, the CEO of Huawei, when she was transiting through Canada at the behest of the United States. That was the result of a warrant issued by the American government. Then moving on to the tariff war around Chinese EVs, Trump tends to insist that the United States gets nothing out of its relationships, that Canada is a free rider, that it only makes sense, it only works as the cherished 51st state. But the reality is that Canada had compromised its own interests in relation to China in very serious ways in order to close ranks and display solidarity, believing that there was an overall Western interest in maintaining the multilateral world order that had advantaged Canada, advantaged the United States, advantaged Western Europe for a very long time, that this was not just a matter of cold-hearted, rational calculation, but that there was an affinity. Canada was on Team West, and when the team captain made a call, then it was incumbent upon all of the members to abide by it. And indeed, the entire framing of Canada's geopolitical vulnerability was this US-centric narrative that the real challenge was China. China was undermining Canada's sovereignty. China was pushing into the Arctic. During the recent election, just last year, a federal election in Canada, Mark Carney identified the People's Republic of China as the main geopolitical threat to Canadian interests and Canadian sovereignty. And now he goes to Beijing, undoes the tariffs, and there's a very clear rapprochement between Canada and China, which is just a reaction, a hedge against all of these overt threats that are coming from the United States. As Carney put it, this is a rupture. The old order that had been established and had served American interests very well since the end of World War II, with Western countries, Western allies as kind of junior partners in this overall structure and framework that mitigated some of the most dangerous short-term calculations that go into realpolitik, that's over. And now we're in this very uncertain liminal period as one order decays, but we have yet to know the shape of the order to come.
Do you want to delve into what do we mean when we talk about the middle powers, and what does Carney see as the role of the middle powers going forward?
Excellent question. So this is a concept that comes out of the Canadian School of International Relations, geopolitics. After all, Canada has never been a great power. It has never even been a major regional power in its own neighborhood because of the preponderant force of the United States. So, in trying to explain its place in the world, develop this concept, the middle power. This is a country that doesn't have the size or heft to be an independent center, one of the two superpowers in the bipolar world order, or center of its own in the emerging multipolarity, but which has enough size or population or economic development or strategic value so that it can play a role within a certain circumscribed limits on the world stage, right? You don't get to dictate what everybody's going to eat, but you can get a seat at the table. And this term becomes more and more relevant under conditions of fragmenting multipolarity. We can certainly describe Canada as the paradigmatic middle power. Countries like Australia, there you have a country that has a smaller population, smaller GDP than Canada, but because it's in a relatively lonely area, it could play an outsized role in Southeast Asian and oceanic politics. Countries like South Korea, countries like Vietnam, as well as the individual member states of the EU. Collectively, the EU may be a superpower, even if right now its strategic and security footprint is relatively small, relatively modest by those standards. But the individual states can best be thought of as middle powers, ranging from, upper middle Germany to teeny middle Austria, right? But these are countries that have that combination of strategic heft, access to advanced technology, economic dynamism, and thanks to their particular identity and historical contingencies, they enjoy some legacies, some advantageous legacies coming out of the US-centric world order. And Trump's contention is that none of this matters. There's perhaps 3 states in the world that even count, and everybody else are peons or property to be disposed of and distributed among them. And the only challenges that exist in such a system, as long as the 3 main powers can reach some kind of agreement, is if some of these peons are too insubordinate to accept their lot, and then you have to spank them. That's the Trump mentality, right? The ungrateful Danes refuse to cough up Greenland. Venezuela refuses to accede to American domination, so it needs to be reminded with a kidnapping and the vaporization of some boats, regardless of whether or not there was any legal justification under international or even U.S. law to do so. So there's no room for middle powers in that view, and that's a relatively common perspective, even among more sophisticated academic or foreign policy specialists, because it comes out of the most aggressive strains of realist thinking. But when you add up those middle powers, I remember there's a quip about congressional budget making. Sure, you may not have a lot to begin with, but $1 million here, $1 million there, pretty soon you're talking real money. And the reality is that collectively, the European Union, for instance, has a greater GDP than the United States, a larger population. It produces more steel, produces more cement. I believe that it produces more electricity. I'm not certain what it looks like when you add all energy sources combined, but the EU is certainly a match for the United States. The difference in hard power has to do with basically 80 years of differential investment rather than any underlying asymmetry. And when you look at American productivity in those real economic sectors, well, China dwarfs the United States in the production of virtually any strategic commodity. The United States plus Europe might be able to compete. The United States without Europe is just dwarfed in the economic output. And the United States with Europe as a rival, well, at that point, we're not even talking about fighting China for number one. It's a question of how far down the rankings the United States can fall. So the middle power in this particular setting, as long as there are some mechanisms, and the EU provides one, NATO provides another, for multiple countries to pool their security and economic resources together, well, the reality is that you can get to some pretty impressive figures just from the countries that we wouldn't describe superpowers. Right? You can create a superpower out of middle powers if you do it right.
What did you make of was there anything else you wanted to say about Carney's speech that stood out? I know a lot of people are making a lot of hay out of him saying that the rules-based order was a fiction but a useful one. But I don't know if you had thoughts on that or if you thought there's other aspects that are more important.
I think that he's not saying anything novel with that admission. It's more that he's taking what used to be left to the Mitt Romney style quiet rooms and bringing it out into the open. Now, and in a lot of ways, what he's describing matches with a lot of leftist critique of the international order. That international law, to the extent that it exists, obviously does not protect people like the Palestinians. Countries like Venezuela have their sovereignty routinely violated. We could talk about the embargo on Cuba. We could talk about what happened to Libya under NATO bombing, Iraq. There's no shortage of scandalous violations of the norms and letter of international law undertaken by the very states that purport to be the defenders of it. Now, all of that coexists with a lengthy period where rules-based mechanisms really did work for an insider club of countries, not all Western either. Japan, South Korea, Singapore, most of ASEAN, the Gulf Arab states, for instance. And depending on the time and place, we could even talk about some developing countries in Latin America, in Africa. We're able to take advantage. We're able to try to the aspiration of joining that club was not always fanciful, right? For instance, Vietnam begins after the unification at the end of the Vietnam War as a war-torn basket case, right? Bombed into the Stone Age and experiencing grinding and desperate poverty. But through the World Trade Organization, through emulation of Chinese and East Asian developmental strategies, it became a member of this international community, and it did experience real growth and improvement in the material welfare of its people. Now, a lot of that has to do with the fact that it had a capable and strong state of its own, forged through that very conflict with Western powers, that was able to mobilize domestic forces in the pursuit of developmental goals and also push back against the meddling and interference of foreign powers, international businesses, the influence of foreign capital. But this is a case, this is sort of a best case scenario where even a country that begins very far on the outside of the rule-based international order is able to take advantage, make the most of some of these structures and use it to develop and self-strengthen. And it becomes a great success story. To a certain extent, we can say the same even of the People's Republic of China, right? China develops thanks to the World Trade Organization, thanks to capital and technology that's flowing in from the West, largely from the United States, through the structures of the rules-based international order. So now that it's gone, there's many people who in the online left who are reminding the world that what Carney is saying about it being a lie underlines the suffering and the inequity forced onto populations all around the world, whether Central American countries or Iran or Palestine, Iraq, Afghanistan, the list goes on. However, what I think that they may be missing is that those states were the ones excluded from the order. If we destroy the order completely, even as hypocritical and as rotten and as self-serving as it may be, does that mean that we're going to produce something better miraculously somehow? Or does that mean that every country becomes Guatemala? Every country becomes vulnerable in that same way because there's no longer any structures to mitigate or channel the use of power by the mega states, whether they be China, the United States, or Russia. We clearly see that Russia, in the war in Ukraine, has no compunctions against violently asserting its own prerogative. Obviously, the United States has done so as well. In some ways, China, and this dovetails with the rapprochement between Carney and Xi Jinping, China has shown itself to be extremely ruthless in its internal affairs and when its essential state projects are threatened. I mean, look at Hong Kong. But also rational, calculating, reasonable when it comes to relations between states and among states. It is, in some ways, the most promising counterpoint, the most likely source of a new international order if the Europeans and Canadians kind of fail to maintain some of the strongest elements of the old liberal system.
What did you think of some of the other speeches at the World Economic Forum? I mean, I have to be honest. I mean, I watched a little bit of Trump's and then also Howard Lutnick. And I have to say I wasn't really impressed at all. And I did want to talk about what do you think drives the thinking of Trump and this administration when it comes to international relations?
Well, I think that there are countries that have permanent foreign policy interests and a permanent foreign policy agenda. There are countries that may not have a planned out agenda or a specific program, but they do have a certain ideological orientation, which allows you to make sense of what they're doing. And then there's the United States under Donald Trump, where I don't think that there's a program and I don't think that there's an ideology. I think that there's just a very sick psychology at play. And not just Donald Trump's personally, although that alone is the decline of petulant narcissists as they're sundowning into dementia with nuclear football in one hand and an AI-powered tariff machine in the other is bad enough. But I think that there's the reason that Trump is in the position that he is because American society also has some serious psychological contradictions that started out as political ones, as ideological ones, but over time have become central to people's political identities, poisoned personal relationships, and have fundamentally shifted the way that the world is viewed. And I think that Trump can do what he does because his own deficiencies and preoccupations mirror the social anxieties of his base. I think that he has no appetite for complexity and no ability to delay gratification and no sense of responsibility for the stewardship of the country that is under his power. Instead, and you can see this in the way that he discusses things like World War II. He has no credit for the American victory, obviously not, right? He wasn't around then, but he doesn't even come out of a tradition, be it military service or some kind of family connection or a lengthy association with statecraft that he could really tap into and say that I am a representative, I'm the successor of FDR. No, he fell into this position of power through basically the world's most intense and high stakes reality TV contest, and now acts as though all of America's achievements are personal reflections of his individual greatness. So he is due a Nobel Peace Prize. He is due the island of Greenland. He is due deference and respect and fawning admiration for all the peoples of the world. And if he doesn't get it, he's more than happy to resort to brute force and to spectacular ways of acting out. I think that another key is he surrounds himself with people who are more than willing to enable all of his psychological and emotional pathologies.
You
in
mean
order
he's
to
surrounded by sycophants?
Yes, yes, he is. He's surrounded. But worse than regular sycophants, he's surrounded by sycophants that have their own extremely destructive agendas. For instance, Steve Miller is a sycophant to Trump and a Nazi to everybody else. Right? The Marco Rubio clearly has aspirations for a general realignment across the Caribbean and Latin America. And he's willing to say and do whatever it takes to entertain and indulge Trump in order to get that. And all the way down, whether it's Elon Musk and the tech oligarchs or Howard Lutnick or financial companies, you have people behaving in the same way. They realize that this is destructive. They realize that this man is an arsonist, but they see in this moment and in this person a rare conjunction, an opportunity to fundamentally reshape American domestic politics and the international order to their advantage. And they're willing to pay the price. They're willing to make other people pay the price. More specifically, to let that happen. And I think that what they will discover is that the institutions that they're destroying, things like NATO, the UN, global economic integration, these were generated not as welfare schemes to foreigners or means of distributing largesse, but they lower the cost of compliance and authority for the United States. They make it easier and cheaper to be hegemon number one, to dominate, to have other countries do carry out what could be extremely costly policies in that favor the United States, with Canada's brinksmanship against China being a prime example. Right? Canada did not benefit at all from detaining Meng Wanzhou, had no interest in detaining Meng Wanzhou or going after Huawei. Right now, I would say that Canada's interests are better served welcoming Huawei in as a balance against the domination of American tech platforms that have made it very clear that they have no obligation to safeguard or secure the sovereignty of any country but the United States, and no real interest in looking after following laws or regulations that aren't in line with those that can be imposed on them by Trump and the American administration. So you have overall American hegemony deeply indebted to all of these middle powers that have been taking it on the chin and self-limiting their own horizons of what is possible for the sake of a strong relationship with the United States and the maintenance of this order, which from their perspective is worth the cost because it prevents this type of brutal, transactional, and exploitative behavior by more militarily powerful countries. Now that they're getting the exploitation anyway, why would they continue with the compliance? And it would be different if Trump went after one country at a time. That would be the sensible strategy. If that were the case, then we could talk about some kind of overall agenda or plan based in Washington. But the moment they capture Maduro, before Venezuela is even stabilized, before there's any clarity on what happens next, before any oil is being exported, they immediately go on to threaten Colombia and Cuba and Canada and Denmark, right? So if you go after everyone else in the world and you no longer have 50% of the world's economy, you no longer have that, 1940s, 1950s, early 60s full spectrum domination, then they're going to begin to quiet quit out of your order. And these countries, when you look at Europe, when you look at some of America's allies in East Asia, they have the state capacity, the economic strength, the sophistication to create a club of their own, which doesn't require American participation. Indeed, I think that for a long time, trying to imagine something like a better future that could plausibly come about, the most persuasive case that I could make for myself, right? The most likely scenario would be something like China stepping back a little bit from repression, becoming a less frightening actor to its neighbors and to its citizens, while the non-American countries of the West move away from uncritical support of the United States and reach some kind of modus vivendi with a rising China. That combination, where you can keep some of the better elements of the liberal international order while transitioning to a world scenario where China is the hegemon and the types of benefits that Chinese economic output can bring to every country in the world. I mean, already the Belt and Road Initiative has transformed much of Africa, has transformed much of Eurasia, given opportunities to some very low income countries for development and built infrastructure in places um, where there had been no alternatives before. If you take that economic output and that technical expertise, right, China right now is becoming the main driver of technological innovation and scientific discovery. You attach that to the capital pools and the legacy development of the countries of the West, minus the United States, that could be a very constructive partnership, which might actually be able to tackle global challenges like climate change, transition to green energy, maybe even movement of peoples, refugees, other types of global issues where the United States, even before Trump, would speak a good game, but fail to actually deliver real leadership.
Do you mind if I don't want to go off into too much of a tangent, but I wanted to go back to something you said about uh, how I don't really think there is an ideology, and I think you said this as well. I don't think there's an ideology really driving Trump other than sort of a really crude might makes right sort of militarism. And I bring this up because I don't necessarily, when it comes to international relations, I don't necessarily come from like a classically left-wing perspective. I'm not like super versed in left-wing theory when it comes to international relations. I come more from like the realist sort of school and background, and I don't necessarily, for people listening, this does not mean John Mearsheimer and offensive realism. I'm more influenced by people like Kenneth Waltz, structural and defensive neorealists, and even the classical realists like Morgenthau and Kennan. Um, and there are people that will say, well, Trump is. I've seen people defend Trump as bringing us back to realism because he's concerned with, spheres of influence. And I'm like,
Battleships.
yeah, but to me, this is not, whether you agree with like realist lines of thought or that school, I don't think this is like realism, except in the crudest possible sense, maybe, because ultimately, might makes right does not make responsible statecraft. It's not enough for responsible statecraft, and might makes right can often lead to recklessness that leads to the downfall of nation states and empires. So, look, I don't even see this as being I don't see this as being ideological in a weird way. I think it's just this crude might makes right sort of nonsense. I hope I'm making sense, but it's like I don't see
Oh,
this as being
certainly.
driven by like a school of thought or tradition within international relations that's really thought out.
I agree. I think that you're onto something. The, for instance, if you think about it from a strictly realist perspective, the United States had uh, enjoyed tremendous benefits from the structure of the international rule-based system, especially since it enjoyed I believe the Schmittian term is um, the art of the exception or the state of the exception, right? There was a rule-based system that could be enforced on everybody else, and then the United States was free to violate it whenever it felt like it, and didn't even need to acknowledge that it was violating the rule-based order, let alone provide any justifications. That's a position of tremendous strength and power, right? Especially since you're embedded by an entire bevy of middle powers that are all, as Carney put it, um, colluding with that lie. If you're really focused on American strength and power, well, the most realist thing I could think of is lie, say that you're not a realist, um, but maintain all of these institutions as mechanisms, as uh, part of your apparatus of control. say that you've gone past might makes right, but in reality, you've just disguised the operation of your might through international organizations, treaties, you name it, coalitions of the willing. And that system really worked for a very long time. I do not know if at its inception, the balance was true believers who felt that they were building an international system of law and that they were contributing to the eventual nucleus of a world government or federation or some kind of transcendence away from the nation state model towards global governance. I don't know if that mentality was the dominant one, or if it was this calculation that it's going to be cheaper, it's going to cost us fewer soldiers, and we're going to make more money if we do it this way than if we just occupy Guatemala forever. And I think that if you're someone like Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, Mitt Romney, if you're a dyed-in-the-wool member of the American political elite, then you're inducted into these, you're initiated into these secrets, right? You're told that, like, look, the reason that we have these institutions and the reason that we don't just conquer Canada is because it actually works out a lot better for us. So, you know, if you don't buy the ideological justification and you really are a might makes right person, you still should play by the rules because it's a more effective means of being might makes right. What Trump is doing, well, I think it's enough to know that the mood now in the People's Republic of China is jubilant because he is behaving better than they could expect of a deep cover operative that they had placed 50 years ago in the United States and who had ascended to the lofty heights of political power there. He is shredding every basis of American international power. He is destroying all of these mechanisms, all of these systems, these networks of authority that had buttressed the United States and allowed it to continue to dominate even as the relative difference between its economic development and the rest of the world kept shrinking and shrinking and shrinking, as was inevitable, right? You can't, I believe in 1948 or 1949, the United States had, and this is a figure cited by Kennan, it had more than 50% of the world's economic output while having like 4% of the world's population. So the United States enjoyed that level of domination well beyond the rebalancing of the global economy, thanks to these institutions that it had built. Now, all of that's gone. And so the United States is naked and alone in a lot of ways, now that as it begins to move to try to confront and contain China. And China, imagine, if you will, spheres of influence. Spheres of influence that are not established through some kind of dialogue and inclusion, like the EU, but spheres of influence that are just me and the three other emperors drew lines on a map, and you peasants are in my section, so do as I say. The amount of force that it would take for the United States to subdue Venezuela alone, go in, reconstruct it, eliminate all the insurgencies, slaughter all of the resistance, put in your elites, train your elites, do what the British did in India, for instance. Imagine how costly that would be. And that's just one country. Now think about doing that to Canada. Think about doing that to Mexico. Think about doing that to Colombia. Think about doing that to Brazil, right? The amount of money, the human lives, military resources necessary to actually enforce that type of hemispheric dominance against the interests, against the will of the people of the hemisphere, that will certainly destroy the United States without doubt. So I think that there is no vision here. There is no there's nothing durable that can be built through this mechanism. Even if you take Greenland, right, that is going to turn into uh, a major headache, a nightmare for the United States as all of the second and third order implications uh, begin to add up. And I don't know what happens when Trump is gone, because this is, I believe, a real manifestation of his own psychology.
I want to word this well,
Mhm.
but you almost have to tip your hat to him because he has accelerated it. I mean, he is doing a lot within like 1 year span. I mean, he's wrecked everything.
It's breathtaking.
Yeah.
The He is speed running the apocalypse, right? Trying to knock out absolutely every uh, limitation, every, it's like going down to New Orleans and one by one blowing up every dam, every levee in sight.
He's
Whether,
immensitizing the eschaton.
yes, exactly. And I think that that may explain some of his appeal with not just the alt-right, but certain parts of the tech industry that really do believe that industrial civilization, modernity are done, and we need to get to the collapse as quickly as possible so that um, we can build the after state from the ground up. Destroy everything so that we finally can build anew on the rubble. And the fact that he's doing it all at once is the real tell for me. Even the most aggressive and expansionist uh, world leaders, ones that had a total preoccupation with the domination of their near abroad or uh, global conquest, understood that you do not begin your international campaign before you've consolidated domestic power. But we're seeing that contest for control of the United States, for post-constitutional MAGA uh, directorate, let's say, with ICE and BPD as its stormtroopers. That's playing out right now, and it hasn't succeeded yet. The outcome is still uncertain. There are major opposition political leaders that are walking freely. Uh, Jimmy Kimmel still on TV. So you have not yet consolidated authoritarian control, but you're already going after Greenland, shredding local alliances, antagonizing your neighbors. This is not a responsible um, or well thought out program, even if you your ultimate goals would be authoritarianism and a 1,000-year American republic, right? MAGA forever. So I think that this is going to exhaust itself at some point. I don't know what that looks like, right? Is it that domestically you succeed in trivializing elections and marginalizing the opposition, right? Won't be something. It won't be Saddam Hussein style, but something like Orbanism in Hungary, where you can still have opposition parties, but they don't really matter. You've managed to put your cronies and your cadres in charge of all the social and cultural institutions that matter. Um, but you have to back off the foreign policy adventurism, or do you have a And in that case, like maybe Marco Rubio or JD Vance, whoever is Trump's successor, uh, executes Steve Miller, uh, Yezhov or Beria style, and tells everybody like, okay, we're backing off some of the worst excesses here, but we're also not going to relinquish power. Or do you have a situation where someone like Gavin Newsom manages to climb back through electoral politics into Democratic control of the White House, and then they have to try to stitch back together the um, the old rules-based order? I mean, what would that even look like uh, at this point? There's a term that the Russians and Chinese would use to describe the United States as, in order to explain the failure of diplomacy, and they would say that the American government, the American system, is not agreement capable. You could negotiate something, they could sign something, you could both parties, in absolute good faith, may conclude an agreement and get to work on implementing it. But the United States will change its mind unpredictably. There will be some senator from South Carolina or some electoral upset, and all of a sudden you're back to square one, which means that if you have any vital interests, any
I was
aspect
going to say
of
that the Iran nuclear deal is like a perfect example of that.
exactly,
JCPOA. Yeah.
precisely, the Iran nuclear deal, if that can't be honored, if that has a electoral shelf life, then how can Russia accept any negotiated um, outcome to the conflict in Ukraine, which doesn't give them everything that they believe they need? Now, there's, I don't know if that was true when Russia, especially Vladimir Putin and Sergei Lavrov, were forwarding this as a explanation for the failure of diplomacy in Ukraine.
Yeah, I think you've been very critical of Putin on that. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's certainly true now. The there's After the abrogation of the U.S. Mexico Canada free trade agreement, which Trump himself had negotiated and signed in his first term, how can you trust anything that comes out of the United States? How can any document with Trump's signature on it be taken seriously? It becomes immediately laughable. There's no way that you can negotiate the sale of Greenland because Iceland's going to be next, right? No treaty is secure, no agreement is real. Therefore, it's a matter of, do you push back now or do you push back later? And I think that um, that's a lesson that is going near and far, and countries are going to change their policies to reflect that new reality. And the irony, too, is that the United States has demonstrated that it is not agreement capable. But there are all kinds of other countries, not just middle powers, that have a pretty good track record of living up to their agreements, of doing what they said they would, and working out disputes in peaceful, amicable, and procedurally transparent ways. Think of Brexit, right? That was a major crisis for the European Union, and it was handled in a very diplomatic, dare I say, gentlemanly type of way. So it is possible, but just not with the U.S.
Uh, I've been criticized for not covering ICE enough on my program, and there's reasons for that that have more to do with I'm thinking more abstract long-term future, and I can explain what I mean by that later. But how important do you think it is that we do cover ICE, and what do you want to say about what is happening with ICE right now?
So I think that the advent of ICE and its emergence as this federal coercive apparatus, this security force that is answerable only to the executive office and unconstrained by statutory or even constitutional limits. That this is an extremely serious development. It basically represents the same kind of breach, the same kind of rupture that Carney described, except in the context of American constitutionalism. This is a force which should not exist within the structures of American democracy. This is a force that American democracy was designed to prevent. So I think that it's an extremely serious development. And in an article I wrote with Ben Burgis in The Jacobin, we discussed what a second Trump term would look like and how you could tell that it was going to go in an authoritarian direction. And for me, I spent many years in Washington, D.C. I worked with different security agencies, lots of military personnel, lots of different government officials. And everything that happens in the United States through government channels has to go through a complicated morass of bureaucracy and regulations. It's a challenging system to navigate, let alone to reform. If you're serious about authoritarianism, if you're serious about trying to consolidate power, then you're going to need to break those institutions, those limitations, and to replace the people who are there now, who have dedicated their careers in the service of this constrained and limited and not always efficient, but nominally constitutionally compliant way of doing things, that have sworn their oaths to the Constitution, that have been properly indoctrinated. You have to get rid of all of those and replace them with people who are going to break the rules and do what you tell them. People like Pete Hegseth, people like Kash Patel. And that's exactly what we've seen happen. There's been an incredible exodus out of the security services. FBI, agents, CIA, NSA, the Department of Defense has seen large numbers of officers resigning or fired. And these are purges. These are loyalty purges to replace those cadres that take the constitutional and statutory limitations of their oaths, of their duties, the US government, to the American Constitution seriously. All of those need to go. And people like the ones that we have in charge now, and in some ways, the foreign policy team, like Marco Rubio, is one of the few individuals inside the Trump administration with real authority that has experience of his own, that is a kind of capable and well-versed actor in that field. Kristi Noem, she's a non-entity. She's a loyalist. Kash Patel, Pam Bondi, right? These are courtiers. They're not officials. They're not bureaucrats. They are personal servants of Donald Trump. And with these types of figures in charge of the law enforcement apparatus, they literally have the power of life and death over American citizens. That's major rupture. And if it isn't stopped now, the big, beautiful bill, I had great anxiety reading it, because apart from all of the conventional criticisms, what I saw in it was the massive bump in budgeting for ICE detention centers and Department of Homeland Security personnel. those are going to be the foot soldiers of a new American authoritarianism. And we're seeing that play out right now. The question is, will this work? Right? The outcome is still in doubt. The game is still going on. But that clearly is the intended destination, to have a force that's directly loyal to central political authority that'll carry out whatever the will is of the president.
Before we close out, I guess I won't say it's my biggest concern, but even beyond authoritarianism, I feel like we're in the middle of a dark cloud and there's going to be an even bigger catastrophe than even the authoritarianism itself. And what I mean by that is, I've had like people that are all excited about Trump's breaking from Europe and bullying Venezuela, et cetera, et cetera. And I had a friend that Florida is like Republican Central, but I had someone quote that line from the Peloponnesian War: the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer or endure what they must. And I said, yeah, but you're forgetting the other parts of the story, because eventually the Athenians, their own hubris and delusions, or what in Greek tragedy, ate, the goddess that brings delusions, hubris and delusions bring on nemesis, and then there's correction, and there's punishment. A powerful state can destroy itself if it ignores limits. And also might makes right. A state can be strong and another state can be weak, but a weak state can become strong and a strong state can become weak. And a clever state can outsmart a strong state. None of these things are like, what's the word? They're not set in stone. These things are fluid. And
Yes.
I've tried explaining this to people that are buying into this Trump stuff. I just think what Trump's administration regime is doing is completely reckless. And I think fearlessness of this sort, this kind of recklessness, is going to lead to catastrophe, not just with authoritarianism, but I just don't think any of this works out for anyone in the long run. I think it's inviting a massive catastrophe. And I'm sorry if I'm like referencing like Greek tragedy, but it feels like we're living in one.
I don't think that's inappropriate at all. And if you to
And I also
bring
I wanted to say real quick, I also think it is important that people think about history and actually know it rather than, just quote, specific lines.
of
Anyways, go
course,
on.
but to reference something a little more recent, I believe it was in his military industrial complex farewell address, Eisenhower described every weapon, every airplane, every bomber, every naval ship as a hospital that wasn't built, a child that wasn't educated, social need that wasn't met. And we could also say an investment that wasn't made. When you build these immediately obsolete, antiquated, poorly planned, poorly designed battleships because Trump likes it, well, that is this classic Hayekian malinvestment, right? You're spending a lot of money in pursuit of what is actually a value destroying enterprise. And if you are investing so much in your coercive capability, especially a coercive capability that you're turning inwards against your own people, then consider what you're doing to the productive base of your country. The immigrants that are being expelled are the backbone of manufacturing, of food services, of food and agricultural production, right? Slaughterhouses, harvesting crops, agriculture, construction. So you are reducing your own experienced and capable labor force. You are shunting healthy, fit, um, young, mostly men that could be replacing them into ICE and Customs and Border Patrol, um, where they aren't actually contributing. They're not producing anything. They're not building anything. They're not making the country stronger. They're just busting heads. And meanwhile, China is building dark factories that require no human input and can produce EVs, can produce network equipment, can produce high-end electronics. The students that you're purging because they don't like Palestine or you don't like where they're from are the mainstay of your engineering departments, of your STEM faculty, right? You are cutting your own throat through all of this. And the type of strength that you're building within your state apparatus is just repression. That's the one thing that they can do. The elimination of USAID, the Doge defunding of every agency of sort of disinterested public benefit, the weather service, right? You are wiping out the very foundations of what allows the U.S. economy to function and the U.S. society to operate as well as it has. In the very same moment as a climate catastrophe is coming, where you should be investing in resilience or remediation, right? That money shouldn't be going to ICE. It should be going to FEMA. But you're cutting back the very cadres, the very institutions that you need in order to weather the crises that are coming, and instead you're busting heads in Minneapolis. So I think you're right. By focusing on political power and repression, by over-indexing on the idiot's notion of strength, the United States is making itself much more vulnerable to catastrophes to come, and it's undermining the trust and stability of its own internal population dynamics. So when those crises come, you pointed out that Florida is a staunchly Republican state. Now imagine what happens when tornado season means that parts of Florida become uninhabitable, right? You can't stay there anymore. Things flood. Maybe diseases come back because no one's getting vaccinated anymore either. So it won't start out with Miami and Orlando, but you'll have second-tier cities that will gradually be abandoned. Now, where will they go? Well, Minnesota is a state that is relatively robust when it comes to climate vulnerabilities. But how do you think the Minnesotans will react to having a whole bunch of MAGA refugees coming to settle, especially in a context where there's no FEMA money, right? They would immediately become wards of the state of Minnesota, wards and carpetbaggers. That alone would be enough to drive major social and political crises. But in the context of everything else that we're seeing, yeah, the potential here, everyone is concerned about the consolidation of American authoritarianism, as they should be. But the next phase after the creation of this overpowered, coercive state apparatus is the collapse of that coercive state apparatus and the fragmentation that comes with no central authority, no coordinating mechanisms to handle these mounting and accumulating crises. At that point, right, you might have, we've seen states fail of their own accord before, right? There was a Ponzi scheme that brought down the entire state structure of Albania about 20 years ago. And Haiti, the recent earthquake, it broke the state operations that were always fragile in that country. We could see something similar happening where um, you have political contestation turning violent at exactly the same moment as material crises, shortages of food, climate disasters are forcing a very brutal kind of adjustment in the United States, which no longer has the institutional resources to manage it.
Well, I wanted to ask you because I do have listeners. My listeners run the gamut from like, left wingers, social democrats, and tankies to like, there are conservatives that listen to my show. Like I said, I am influenced by sort of realist thought, so that brings in certain conservatives. And I even have people, I'm not saying they're MAGA types, but they're types that would like to see things like uh, a return of US manufacturing. Uh, and I tell people like that, I'm like, Matt, I don't think Trump can deliver any of that. And in a weird way, I think Biden actually was trying to deliver that more than people realize with things like the CHIPS Act. Um, what would you say to sort of like MAGA or not even MAGA, but like MAGA adjacent type conservatives that are interested in U.S. industrial base and manufacturing? Because I don't think they're going to get it.
No, they certainly won't. I would tell them that industrial reshoring, it's a very complicated process, but there are certain contours, certain fundamentals that you can recognize, that you can take for granted right off the top, right? If you are going to build a factory or reinvigorate an industrial sector, let's say steel or rare earth minerals, right? There's a crucial resource that's currently um, essentially monopolized and controlled by China, especially the refinement of rare earth minerals. And if you want to be meaningfully sovereign, if you want to have an independent, robust um, manufacturing capability, especially in high tech, you're going to need to be able to source your own rare earth minerals. Well, sure, that requires plants, right? You need people who make the investments. That requires technology, but it also requires a skilled, disciplined, and sizable labor force, because you're not just looking at that sector, but you also have to think about all of the other sectors that feed into it, right? If you're going to build the rare earth refinery, where are you going to source that equipment? If you're going to produce the type of waste that comes with rare earth mineral refinement, who's going to handle it? How are you going to process it? Where will it go? That requires civil engineers. That requires advanced chemistry. That requires another entire subsector. Does the United States have the people, have the skilled labor necessary to staff that enterprise? No, it does not. But it has these amazing universities. It has world-killing institutions of higher education, innovation factories. So they could theoretically produce those workers. But if they were going to, then you would see that happening now. We know what's happening on universities right now. Foreign students are getting rounded up. The access to foreign scholars, visiting professors, etc., is drying up. Talent is moving abroad. Exactly the opposite of what you would need to bring in to revitalize these advanced manufacturing sectors. If it were going to work, we would already be seeing those foundational measures in place. But what we're seeing instead is the destruction of the very institutions and the very pipelines that would be required to make this thing work. You can't just bully an industrial renaissance into being, but that's the one thing that Trump has at his disposal. He just bullies, cajoles, threatens tariffs. And maybe you can do that if you have a supine, desperate, broken workforce or a subject people that had no choice but to cough up what you need. You can run a plantation that way. You might be able to run a cobalt mine in the Democratic Republic of Congo that way, but you cannot run a rare earth refinery that way. You cannot run an electric vehicle plant that way. You cannot run a nuclear power plant that way. So I personally have there's nothing ideologically or in terms of my interests as a Canadian or as a Pole that would lead me to object to an industrial renaissance in the United States. I would love to see that.
Well, even just even if not even a renaissance, but like a boost in domestic industry. Like there
Yes.
are ways that could have been done. That's why I mentioned the CHIPS Act. I think that's what it was doing. I'm not saying
Yes.
Biden was the greatest thing since sliced bread, but it was something. It was a bone that people, if you care about boosting domestic industry, the CHIPS Act
He was turning the ship around.
Right. Yes.
He was trying to, and Trump instead stopped turning the ship around and is going full speed into the iceberg. If the fact that he's so out of step with renewable energy is also just this shocking own goal. You don't have to be a dyed-in-the-wool environmentalist or some kind of eco hippie to just read the pricing divergence between fossil fuel and legacy energy on one hand and renewables on the other. China has used its manufacturing. It has done the things that I've said. It educated generations of engineers. It focused on first basic industry and advanced industries, all of the feeders to create a network for innovation and for the development of technologies and the improvement of existing technologies, because it isn't always going to be this moonshot breakthrough, right? You can get to a transformative technology by iterating on existing capabilities. China did all the things, right? It took them a while. It took them 50 years to get to the point where they are building the best, cheapest solar panels in the world. Every year they're going to get better. And every year power and electricity in China as a result is going to get cheaper, and fossil fuels will be more and more trivial, like less and less significant. The United States has guaranteed that it will be locked into these dirty, polluting, and ultimately economically unviable sources of energy, instead of joining the rest of the world in the same kind of shift that occurred when you went from horse and buggies to railroads, right? Like what Trump is, the way that he talks about windmills is like the paranoid and superstitious Luddite opposition to the steam engine. And if there were some other alternative, right? Like, prove me wrong. Where is the breakthrough fossil fuel innovation that is going to make it cheaper to drill for Texas Brent crude or refine the Venezuelan sludge into usable fuel? Where is the improvements in efficiency that let you take what is a non-renewable resource and extend it and make it power this very thirsty, energy-intensive AI boom that you have right now? I don't see anything. I don't see anything. Like you can have, if you want to power AI, well, China's going to be building solar plants and renewables in order to do that. You're going to be burning down fossil fuels and exacerbating both the climate crisis and depleting your stocks of non-renewable energy as a result. If you want to have that kind of economic renaissance, if you want to get back to the periods when American workers were at the forefront of industrial technology and could command a living wage for a family, could support, your entire trad calf extended universe on a single income, you're going to need some type of breakthroughs, some types of improvements and challenges that will improvements and developments that create these economic, not just industry, but economically viable industry. And none of that is happening. And you've shot your innovation engine in the head because of all of these cuts to grants through the National Institutes of Science, the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health. You're at this point, right? My main issue with MAGA and what I would tell them is, I understand your goals, I understand your priorities, and I sympathize with them, right? You want to make the American economy more dynamic, more inclusive, more, you want to make it work for Americans, and you want to get away from the precariousness and inequity of the current system. I get that. I sympathize. And God bless you, good luck. But you need a plan. You need to actually do the things that will get you there rather than owning libs, busting the heads of immigrants, tearing down liberal institutions, driving out your professors, and hoping that this somehow, I don't know, placates the gods of the market into doing everything for you.
Well, so the note I wanted to end on, and I know I've been more philosophical in this conversation. I guess I'm turning into like a quietist that's reflecting on everything lately. But what I wanted to close on was, have you ever seen the movie JFK? Oliver Stone's JFK?
I have, yes.
There's that great line in it where, Garrison says, "Now we're through the looking glass here, people. White is black and black is white." And I've been feeling that way a lot recently because I look at what calls itself the conservative movement in America, and it doesn't seem like it wants to conserve anything. And I know we can have arguments that it never really did, American conservatism, but I think there's a philosophical tradition of conservatism that is about the conservation of society, stability, and order. And what's weird to me is I think what American conservatives are doing, or at least the Trump administration, is it's not interested in conserving anything. It's interested in a wrecking ball, just, burn it all down, pure nihilism. And in a weird way, it's almost like I said to someone recently, it's almost like the Mamdanis and the Social Democrats are the ones trying to conserve society, and it's the conservatives that are trying to burn everything down. The Social Democrats are the conservatives now, and the conservatives are actually burn it all down nihilists. And I know that sounds crazy, but that's almost how I'm interpreting things now.
I think that you're really onto something with that. When you look at Mamdani or Bernie Sanders, the sort of DSA wing of the Democratic Party, there are the obligatory genuflections towards identity politics, and that sounded a little too flippant, right? I believe that they're sincere in the values that they have for multiculturalism, for gender inclusion. All of that is real. But the focus with Mamdani, with Bernie Sanders, has always been Medicare for all, affordability, right? Issues that are bread and butter and that reflect the interests and concerns of working class Americans and middle class Americans for that matter. Their program boils down to, didn't we have it great when Nixon was president, right? In terms of the economic disparities, in terms of productivity, in terms of the condition of the working and middle classes in the United States. So I can't think of anything more conservative than that, right? They really do want to go back to an actual period when America was working.
Do you say Nixon because he was sort of the last Republican that believed in like society, so to speak?
Yeah, Nixon gave us the EPA.
Right.
Honestly, and and as you point out, he's a Republican, right? And not only that, but one of the most maligned former U.S. presidents. But compared to the situation as it stands now, like, Nixon's policy agenda seems extremely enlightened. And so there isn't that much, that segment of the progressive movement really isn't that radical, which is why they always have to shift the ground away from discussing economic policy to Ilhan Omar is Muslim and AOC is brown, right? Make it an issue of identitarian threat rather than an apples to apples comparison of different economic programs. The conservative movement, I think a comparison with Canada could be instructive. Canada has the two-party plus system. It has the Conservative Party, it has the Liberal Party, and then there's the Greens, the NDP, and the Bloc Québécois. And the two main parties are both wings of the establishment elite, the people who own the country, more or less. And they are interested in types of administration and types of political programs that don't threaten their position at the top of society. And maybe every once in a while, they'll take another 1% of the country's GDP to distribute upwards. The function of the other parties is to try to get in the way of that and prevent it from happening. And the two elite parties recognize that, look, we can, if we want this to keep going, if we want to be comfortable here at the top, then every once in a while we have to throw those dirty proles and plebes a bone. We have to make sure that there's enough still being distributed and enough services and resources available so people can show up to work, do what they need to. They don't get too angry. They consume in the right way. They produce in the right way, and they stay where they are, and we stay where we are. And growth can potentially make everyone a little bit richer. Now, whether or not we can argue the details about whether or not that system has been effective, but that's the mentality. And I feel like prior to Donald Trump, that was, or maybe you have to go back to Ronald Reagan, but for a long time in the post-war period, that was the attitude of the two main American parties. You had an elite that was bifurcated down the middle, but they were both conservative in the sense that they understood that their privilege and wealth came out of the operation of the system, and that they should keep the system going if they wanted to keep enjoying its fruits. Then I think that a couple of things broke down. One, in a bipartisan way after Reagan, both elite parties became destructively greedy and started arrogating more and more of the collective wealth, of the national wealth, to redistribute upwards. You had this very twisted situation in which being president was a stepping stone to what you really wanted to be, which is an oligarch. And that hollowed out both the savings and material conditions of working and middle class Americans, because you needed to get that wealth somewhere to shunt it up the system. And it also undermined faith that the system was working for the sake of the mass of the country. That created the opening for someone like Trump to come in. And his issue is that the wrong people have benefited from the upwards redistribution of wealth. People like Obama, people like the Clintons, foreigners, minorities, women. So a system which redistributes wealth into those hands and not the hands of Trump and his loyalists, that was an easy target to mobilize popular anger and resentment at, especially since you didn't have to lie, right? You just pointed at the hypocrisies and the self-dealing of figures like, Obama, the Clintons. I mean, the behavior of Hillary and Bill Clinton, right? Whether it's Epstein or the Clinton Foundation, absolutely scandalous. So you just had to say the truth about them, and you could mobilize a great deal of public anger. You're also upsetting the fruit cart when it comes to the intra-elite consensus on staying in power through relatively, comedy and norms. And finally, now is the time of great vengeance, where that all of the institutions that had favored all the people that Trump and MAGA don't like are getting burned down with no clear vision for what comes next. And of course, Trump is going to steal enough money so that he feels that he'll be secure no matter what the outcome, or at least, in the few years that he has remaining. But yeah, it is a burn it all down situation. And I don't know what'll come out of that burning ground.
Do you want to leave it at that, or is there anything you want to say in closing? I'll give you the floor.
If you're in the United States, then there are some challenging decisions to make, because on the one hand, you need to, and you care about the American experiment, constitutional democracy, and just the basic welfare of people in your community, in your country. You need to participate. You need to stay put, stay in place, stay active, support one another. That also puts you at risk, as we've seen in Minneapolis, as we've seen in Los Angeles, as we've seen in Portland and elsewhere.
We just saw it in Florida too. We just had a woman who had Miami Beach police visit her for criticizing Israel, or she criticized her local mayor and said, "Oh, he doesn't care about the Palestinian genocide." And the Miami police gave her a visit.
This is not acceptable, right? If
it's not normal either.
Yeah, it's not normal either. Exactly. Even in the darkest periods of America's past, the hypocrisy and the fact that violations like this were recognized as violations even by the people carrying them out were a kind of barrier to full-blown authoritarianism. And now that's blown. So whether or not you reach that outcome will depend on the decisions and the actions of individual Americans. That said, you also have to think about your own welfare and that of your families, your loved ones. It's going to be a scary period. And the speech that Mark Carney gave, he quoted Václav Havel describing conditions of living under communist authoritarianism in Czechoslovakia. That's something that I'm very familiar with because my own family comes from Poland, and we left as a result of the repression and the economic failure of late socialist People's Republic of Poland. Americans don't have that experience, but they're going to go through something similar. And everyone will have to make their own decision about whether to stay, whether to go, whether to stand, whether to be quiet, and just try to be there for one another and realize that you're all doing your best. I guess that's all I have.
Dark note to end on, but probably apropos. So, thank you again, Deep State Kuba, for coming on Parallax Views.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
A special thanks to my $10 and above tier supporters on Patreon, who make this show possible with their generous donations. Producers' credits shout out to those supporters: Aaron, Jeremy, Matt, Big Bob's Beepers, James, Enoch, David, Sadad, Tristan, Bob, Eva, Miriam, West Bank Robbery Pod, B. Lund, Transnatural Perspectives Podcast, Dan, Nick, Elliot, Fabian, Tom, Arlen, Bo, Spartacus, James, G, Jamie, Will, JC, WV, Sutra, Orc, Catherine, Darko, Nathan, Holland, Dan, Mark, Chase, Olm, Gary, Emilia, Nick, Brace, Michael, and Brian. Please join those listeners in supporting me at the $10 and above tier of my Patreon page, patreon.com/Parallax Views, if you'd like your very own producer's credit on each and every edition of the program. Until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.